And I'm going to go ahead and share a screen with you. Today's session is all about impact and how you can scale your impact up through measuring and managing impact in a number of different ways. So as I was thinking about this topic, impact is something that I really love talking about and would love to see organizations manage better, because I've been in so many different positions, both working for a nonprofit as well as consulting and in being with nonprofits, that in any situation, you always get those questions of, well, how much of this, or what are your stats on this, or how do you measure X, Y, and Z? And sometimes it's a big scramble trying to find all those things last minute if you're not thinking about them right up front. And so love talking about this today. For anyone who is new to these sessions, new to Curio 412, my name is Carolyn Keller, and I started Curio 412 in 2019 really to serve the philanthropic needs of nonprofits and businesses, doing that as a purpose-driven consultant. In 2019, I was named the Pittsburgh's 30 Under 30 for community leadership and service to nonprofits. And I've been serving nonprofits for nearly a decade now. And as many of you are, I'm a chronic volunteer. Usually I will not say no, so don't ask, or maybe do ask if you really need help. But love working in the philanthropic and social sector spaces. It's always a lot of fun. And so the first thing I wanted to ask everyone, and you can feel free to type this in the chat while I introduce this a little bit, is what does the word impact mean to you? And feel free to throw that in. And I know that we had a few questions about this in our registration, but would just love to hear more. Because oftentimes whenever, as you're thinking about that, I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to be involved with the impact side of things. Typically when I talk about Curio 412 and the work that we do, I say that I'm an impact management consultant. And then the question I always get asked was, well, what does that mean? And what do you actually do? And if you think about impact, and I see Amy's written in the chat, measurement of how successful their mission or vision is. And that's a great start on impact. And there's no wrong answer to what impact means, because impact is going to be different for each organization. You're each making a difference in people's lives. And that's usually how I refer to impact, is thinking about impact is going to be that change. And Michael just put that in the chat too, is change you create. And that change can either be something that's for the better or for the worse. But if you don't have a way to measure and manage that, then you're not quite sure whether you are making that difference for the better or the worse. So when I define impact management and the work that I do as a consultant, it's through a process of using data-driven decision-making in order to plan, organize, and implement impact with that measurable outcome in mind. And I see that Walker's also put in measurable, hopefully positive effects on the lives of people we serve, for sure. And then a question of, are people really finding our work helpful, and will they come back to tell others? That's a great way to be able to gauge and manage that impact. So when I started seriously thinking about impact after nearly a decade of working with nonprofits, I'd been involved with operations, evaluation, grants, and it seemed that every year, like I said, there was some sort of struggle or challenge, or we're scrambling to get different pieces of data. And so it seemed to me that the processes that had been established in the roles I'd been a part of rarely focused on collecting those pieces of impact that demonstrated how we were creating change. And that got me into thinking there has to be a better way in order to plan, organize, and implement impact within organizations in a way that is not so time consuming, because that's another part of impact management, I think, is that when we think about collecting data, that it is very time consuming. So how do you streamline this so you can keep your time to making the most impact doing the work that you do, while also making sure you have the data that you need to tell a good story and to be very convincing to people who support you. And that's why tracking your impact really matters, is that understanding and measuring it is no good unless you're going to use this information strategically within your organization. So you can use the data that you gather through understanding your impact to drive objectives and goals within your organization, and that can be on a executive and board level. You can use it to set baselines for tracking that change and scaling that change that you want to see within your target populations. And then you can also use it to cultivate support from your stakeholders. So people who fund your organization, people who volunteer with your organization, when someone makes an investment into your organization, whether that's money or time, they want to know that it's well spent. And so being able to have these certain baselines for impact management and measurement will help to tell that story and really bring value to the people who support you. So when I do this with a number of people that I work with, we always start with your why and think about these two questions. And as I talk a little bit more about purpose, just describe them in the chat if you feel comfortable. The first question is, what is the specific contribution your organization makes to the lives of others? And can think about that as it applies to your organization, as it applies to the people who come to your organization. And then the follow-up question to that is, what does that contribution allow others to go on to do or be? And that's really that question about change, is how is it changing people, supporting people, helping people? And as you're thinking about that, as you're writing it in the chat, this graphic that's on the side is what's called the Golden Circle. It's from a book called Find Your Why by Simon Sinek. And he talks about how this why is at the center of what you do. And as nonprofit organizations, we typically do have a mission. And that mission will often tell us what we do or how we do it. But sometimes it doesn't really tell the full story of why we do what we do. And so that why is really your motivation. What do you believe that is going to change within the community? Why are you doing the great work that you are? What impact do you want it to have, and what value do you want it to have? And then from this point of why, you can start to think, how are we doing that? And is that really making the change we want? And what are we doing? And is that effectively addressing the change that we want to see? And I'm seeing some great comments come in about some of the things your organizations do to help others find connections with stories about their ancestors. And that's fantastic. To provide household furnishings to those in need at no cost. That's amazing. So as you're thinking about those different things, I always start off with those two questions. And thinking about what your contribution allows others to do and be will help you think about that change you want to see and start the process of figuring out how you measure and track. So in the chat, just write yes, no, sort of. I know you've already answered this question when you registered, but do you track your organization's impact? And I know we have a number of people that signed up, and from the answers we got in registration, it seems like there is probably about half of people who are registered today that said they sort of track impact. 30% answered that they did, and then 12% said they don't. So today's session, I'm hoping that if you don't currently track your organization's impact, this gives you a great starting point to develop a plan to do that. That's not going to be time consuming. That's not going to be an imposition on what you already do, but rather supplement the work that you're engaged in. If you are sort of tracking your organization's impact, but want to get a little bit more focused, I hope that this helps you to get organized in a different way. And if you already are, I hope it gives you a new perspective on what you could do more, or how you could streamline some of those things you already track to really tell the story of what your organization does. So the reason that I always start thinking about the change that happens in terms of how your contribution affects others is because we want to think about outcomes, and we want to measure what really matters for our organization. And some of this thinking comes from a method called results-based accountability, which talks about outcomes being the results that we want to achieve, or the conditions of well-being that we want for a certain group of people. And why does our organization or any organization do anything if not to serve a potential outcome of a customer, a client, or people in need? And that's why having a process that measures the evidence that leads to those outcomes is important to think about. And when we measure these conditions that we want to see, we can start to establish baselines as well as understand when we are making a change within those baselines. So if you're serving, say, an educational program and you'd like grades to improve, knowing where those grades start and whether they're going up or down is going to be important to knowing exactly the way you need to go about reaching that result that you want to achieve. And when you think about outcomes and try to assign measures to outcomes that you want to see, there are always three questions that measures will answer. And these measures are going to help us know whether or not our programs are working, whether our organization is doing the best that it can to make the biggest impact. And these three questions revolve around quantity, quality, effort, and the effects of what happened, which you can see in the graphic off to the side. And the first question is, how much did we do? And that sort of falls into the category of how much effort did we use, how much in terms of quantity did we produce, or how many people did we serve. Second question is, how well did we do it? And that's a measure of quality. So how much effort did we put in? How well was that effort received? What was the quality of effort? Or what was the quality of the product that we created or the program that we put on? And then that last question is anyone better off? And this is the effect that you have on your target population. So as you move through these different channels here, from how much did we do, how well did we do it, and then down to is anyone better off, something you might notice is it gets harder and harder to measure as you move through. Is how much did we do is pretty easy. If you say do 5 fundraising events per year, it's pretty easy to count up 5 fundraising events and the dollars that were raised for each of those. How well did we do it could also be a fairly simple metric to gain. But when you talk about is anyone better off, that's dealing with your target populations of people that you serve. And that introduces a whole other realm of factors that you don't have much control over. But when you get to that question of effect of what's happening, that is where you see a lot of change happen. So that's an area to take a closer look at if it's something you haven't thought about before. And to give you a better idea of what kinds of questions or what kinds of data fall into these different questions, you can see in terms of the how much did we do, like I said, it's a number of customers served or number of people reached, number of activities. And I know this is very small, but we will share the slides and you'll be able to see it on a larger scale. But in terms of how well did we do it, maybe you have something like staff to student ratio or teacher to student ratios might be a measure of how well something is done, or a measure of satisfaction, customer satisfaction via survey. Or maybe it's a activity specific measurement in terms of time to completion, time from start to completion. And then when you're talking about those effects, the is anyone better off question, you're talking about gains, whether that's quantitative or percentage wise in terms of skills, knowledge, opinions, and those things that are changed. Did you help the person with the problem that they have, or did you address their concerns? And I know that there's a number of different types of measures for each different organization. So there's a couple examples here that help to bring this into focus a little bit more. The one that I love is the fire department example, because I think it's very easy to understand. When you talk about how much did we do, you can count up things like the number of responses that a fire department answered. When you talk about how well were those responses received, you can talk about response time and how fast the fire department was able to get to that particular fire. And then when you look at the effect, you can count how many fires were kept to the room of origin. And then overall, if you're talking about maybe the course of a year or a quarter, what were the percent of fires kept to that room of origin, so that you have a generalized understanding of how your response is really achieving that effect that you want. Education is a similar example here with number of students, we already mentioned student to teacher ratio, then you get down to those effect questions of maybe number of high school students that are graduated, how many people were affected, and then the percentage of high school students and the overall picture of, is that percentage increasing or decreasing, or what's going on with that baseline question there. So a number of examples, and I'm sure your organizations all have many different ways that you can apply measures to each of these questions, and just gives you a head start on thinking about what some of these measures could look like as you start to select ones that are most important. Which brings me to the next point, is you can collect measures on everything and anything. And I'm sure that your organizations already have access to a ton of different data sets. So how do you decide what are the most important measures that demonstrate something central about the results you want to see? And typically those fall into that last category of how were people affected in that last question. And you can streamline this even further by trying to ensure you're selecting key performance indicators that will tell that story. And when you're taking a look at all of the different pieces of data that you have, that you can report on, that you can collect, think about the ones that have the best bang for their buck. And that's going to be the indicators or measures that are going to communicate well. So if you're talking to a volunteer or a funder, a donor, anyone who sees this particular statistic should understand the importance of what that measure means and be able to understand that almost immediately. The second thing that you should think about in selecting the key measures that you want to track is that they have to represent something of central importance to the results. So if you're talking about the school example that we had, then you want to take a look at the central importance of the results. So if your goal is to improve quality of education for students, it'll be important to know how many students you're serving. It may be important to know the student to teacher ratio, but if the end goal is to improve that achievement for students, then the indicator that will be most effective at demonstrating that is probably going to be your graduation rates. So being able to go through and say, okay, we've got all of these pieces of data, each of them say something important, but what's of central importance, what makes the most sense to that result that we're after? And that might change if you're talking about something different. With the same school example, maybe instead of looking for graduation rates or student improvement, you're looking to improve the classroom experience to be more one-on-one, in which case maybe the student to teacher ratio is going to be something that indicates that more. So it really does depend on what your goal is. And the third thing that you should think about when selecting those most important measures is making sure that it's a reliable and consistent source of data, because you want to be able to measure this over the course of both short-term and long-term so that you can track that change. Because change, obviously, some changes happen almost immediately, but a lot of changes take months or years before you start to really see the traction of what's going on. And so in order to be able to understand that they're working, you need to know that you have good data that you can work with. And like I said, reliable, consistent, timely. I'd love for you to type in the chat and just tell me where you currently collect data from for your organization. And I know that we've talked a little bit about this, but now that we've looked at the different ways that you can identify your measures, think about impact based on your goals, let's think about what that process looks like now. Awesome. Online registration forms, online surveys. I always recommend something online because it's a great place to have a central location for all of that data. And like we've said, data should be reliable, consistent, and timely. And thinking about all the different types of data that we can have will help to parse that out as well. So all data comes in two forms. You probably already know this, but qualitative, which are the story or narrative based, and then the quantitative, which are the numbers based sources of data. And we can get data from a number of different places. You know, we've just said registrations, online surveys, We can also easily now get data analytics from things like social media, other registrations, and you'll probably have a number of types of data that you work with, such as organizational or programmatic data, like demographics, number of people served. You might get some of that from events or registration. You might have marketing data that will come from your website, your social media, online engagements, email open rates, those types of things that are easily tracked. And then you may also have fundraising or financial data, such as number of funders or grant money received or percent of funding for the types of services you provide. And then obviously you'll have those surveys, focus groups, testimonials, the things that people are saying about you that can't really be quantified, because there's always, for as much as we talk about data and love to have data that is going to guide us and measure, it's oftentimes the biggest changes we see are those things that can't quite be described. But it helps us to use this data to tell that story. So with all these different places to collect data, all of the different places that we can really gain information, I wanted to provide some tips today that are going to help to simplify the way in which you collect your data. Like I said, there are a number of different places you can already go. The data is fairly centralized, but if you're looking to streamline your data collection and keep it in a good central location, then these tips will help you to really save time as you're collecting and then reporting out on data, whether that's in a mainstream sense of you're making some posts for the general public, or you're sending out emails to your email listserv, or if you're writing a grant and really need some good data to bolster that grant. So we've already talked about clear objectives, but I'll say it again, make sure you set clear objectives so that when you are going into your data collection, you know exactly what types of data you need. So with that clear set of goals, you can ensure you're collecting the right information from the start, so you're not overwhelming yourself with other pieces of information that may not be necessary, and you know that you'll have information that serve the purposes you need. And those clear objectives could be programmatic, where it's serving a certain number of people or causing a certain change, but they could also be objectives like, you know, that you have to do an annual report at the end of the year, and this is the type of information that will be expected out of that annual report. And so your objective might be to create that report and have it be an effective tool to communicate to your funders. So those objectives do not have to be solely focused on the impact of your programs. They can also be very practical too. And then once you've done that and you've established what types of data you'll need to collect based on those objectives, establish a process for who, what, and when data is going to be collected, because this is always where there could be a breakdown in terms of how that is collected consistently. So I know I currently volunteer with an organization that's a small heritage center, local heritage center. And the process that we have is primarily right now tracking the number of people who come through the door, as well as collecting testimonials from the people who are in the space and seeing all of the history. And so our process, we've established that the people who work in the gallery, those volunteers that really engage the visitors, they keep track each day of all of the different visitors. We have a central location where it's just a tally board that gets collected every day, and those volunteers are then asked to encourage people to write their names in the guest book and leave the stories of what they said. And now that we've established, you know, who's doing that and what they're doing is collecting those tallies, they're collecting those testimonials, and that fact that it's done every day, then we have a coordinator that comes in and takes that information either once a month or every other month to make sure that every cycle we have accurate and up-to-date numbers on what's going on. So there's multiple people involved, but it is a clear process that's established to understand where that data is collected and who's responsible for making sure it gets there. And then the last thing, which I've been alluding to the whole time, is storing data in a central location. This doesn't necessarily have to be a fancy service, although there are many data collection softwares that you can get that are great, but we can also just have a spreadsheet that helps. So we've developed for today's session something that you can take away with you. And I'll stick this in the chat after we wrap up this portion of the session. And we'll send it to you as a follow-up too, but just a template of all of the different types of metrics you might want to collect. So we have areas, and I'll make this bigger so we can see it a little bit better. But things that we've talked about already, like programmatic data that you collect from programs, events, volunteers, and it gives some descriptions of metrics you might want to consider collecting for those different types of events. Now, when I work with organizations, we tailor this specifically to their programs. This is an overwhelming amount right now, but we've established also a blank tab here for your spreadsheet so you can tailor it to the needs that you have, and they don't have to follow what's in this template at all. They can be very custom tailored to your organization. So that's something that as you fill those out, you can discuss your success criteria that lines up with your objectives, and then maybe keep track on a quarterly basis or expand this to whichever time frame you feel is appropriate for collecting and reporting. And then there's also a space for notes that you can use to write down any specific areas that you really want to remember or target whenever you go to collect this data and report out on it. So we'll share that so that you have something to take away today as a central location. But also know that there are, like I said, other softwares like Google Data Studio, which actually has a visualization component to it, and it just uses spreadsheet technology on Google Spreadsheets. And then we'll create a whole report for you at the end of the year. So it's a very powerful tool, and also free, which is great to be able to leverage those types of free tools. So, but just having a central location that everyone knows where it's located, everyone knows how to update, when to update, is important to keep it all in one place. And then when you have questions that come up about how many people attended these types of events, or how many things did you serve, or what percentage of people come away from your programs better, you have all of those key metrics in one place that you can just go to without having to scramble every time. So now that you have all that data, what you want to do with it is you want to use it to tell this powerful story of what your organization is doing. And this is where you really utilize impact management and the metrics and measures you've been collecting to scale your impact up. Is that wherever you are, you can incorporate data-driven stories so that stakeholders can see your impact. We've talked about using this type of data-driven storytelling in marketing. It's a great way to show just the general public what you're doing, either get people who are potential users of your service interested in learning more, volunteers interested in learning more, or individual donors interested in contributing. I worked with an organization recently who was a economic development corporation that gives loans to small businesses. And as we were talking about their marketing and what might attract more loan applications, we realized that tracking business success was a really powerful metric for them to tell their story. Most businesses fail within the first 5 years, and we found that loan recipients of their particular program ended up surpassing 5 years and were still in existence today, which made their rate of success 25% more resilient. And so telling that type of a story to someone who is interested in a loan but is not quite sure if they're able to meet those matches, telling them, well, you have a 25% chance of being more successful than the average business that fails after 5 years, that tells a very compelling story for a business that is maybe considering and wants to be interested. So that's just one way that you can use this in your marketing. You can also use this in donor and board communications. I have an example of that on the slide following. So I'll move on from that now, but did want to tell a story about soliciting corporate support as well, because this is another interesting area that corporate organizations, whether they're small businesses or larger organizations that have corporate giving programs, are also trying to make an impact. And they want to know that your impact is going to be matching with their impact. And so, and not only that, but they also want to know that their target market matches with your target market. So I was recently in a conversation with someone who owns a tree service who had been walking around at a conservancy, a parks conservancy, and looks around and said, oh my gosh, all of these people are people who might need tree services and care about the environment in the same way that my business does. And so they have now since started partnering with this organization, doing volunteering with them, presenting free informational sessions for and educational sessions for visitors that come around. And in terms of soliciting corporate support as a nonprofit organization, thinking about where are those areas that might match up with corporate sponsors, and how can you really tell that story of the same people that you're trying to reach, we're currently reaching, and if we work together, we can do a lot stronger with it. And that's another way to scale your impact, because then you have multiple people working with you for the same common goal. And there's a few tools that I will typically use. I mean, you can just use this through storytelling and words, but there are things like Canva, which I'm sure a lot of you use for graphics, and it's a really great tool, especially if you're not a graphic designer like me, to pull things together that look fantastic and then tell a story. But there's also a site called Piktochart, which I'll throw these links into the chat as well. And Piktochart is more data in terms of numeric data. So you go in and it will help you create pie charts and graphs. And basically, if you have a spreadsheet and put your numbers into Piktochart, it will produce data visualizations that then you can customize. And it's very simple to use and very similar to Canva. So I always recommend, although Piktochart doesn't have as many free features as Canva, it's still pretty versatile. So to go back to talking about donors and your boards, this is a example, and once again, this is small, but it will be sent in a follow-up as an example of an organization that I recently worked with that was a business chamber of commerce, and we were trying to gather data about all of the different areas of impact. So to reiterate this whole process that I typically go through when I think about data and impact management, is we started by saying, okay, well, what change do you want to make? And where do you see those areas of priority for your organization's impact? And they had identified 3 different areas. One was membership, which you can see we have an area about membership. One was making sure that they were able to grow their reach and presence. And then the other was around service and building resilience for the community. So with those 3 priorities, we asked those 3 questions, and we figured out which measures really told that and which data pieces did they have available at the time to present and show what they had done throughout the course of a year. And so once we were able to grab those pieces, ask those questions, we pulled together this 2-page infographic that was then used for showing their board all of the different things that they'd done in a very simple and easy format. Instead of getting a sort of 10-page board report on everything that the group had done, they were able to have an easily visual piece that they could see in 2 seconds to understand some of the most important features of what the organization had done. So having these pieces of data, like I said, you may have a few, you may have a lot, but when you're able to pull them out and prioritize them by those different impact areas, you can tell that powerful story and get your board to understand where exactly those most important pieces are, so that your board is better equipped to make decisions and help you with the goals of your organization as well. So with that, I'm going to throw a few different things in the chat, like the link to the dashboard, Piktochart, and everything else, but I would love to open this up to questions, any stories that you have of data, any challenges you've had, and just have a conversation with everyone who's here today. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'll stop the recording also. And what questions do you have?